Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Thanks for the thumbs up, people. Kiara, and thanks very much for that introduction. As Michael said, I'm Jo Bailey. I'm a designer and a design academic at Massey University and a long-time TPMer, most recently finishing my PhD earlier this year. And it was very nice of Laura to invite me along today. I'm going to give a bit of a whistle-stop tour, an alphabet of things to think about when you're creating and polishing a poster. So a little bit more context with a very tenuous letter A from an ABC. It's a bit of a mashup, this presentation, of general graphic design things and poster specific things, but hopefully there'll be a good indication here of the kind of stuff you can ask me about at the end, or actually maybe Michael, you can monitor the chat and just, or anyone can shout out as we go along. Because I know you're gearing up to present your work as posters at the HUI. Some of the things I'm going to talk about might not seem directly relevant because they're not strictly related to posters, or they might relate to things like typographic conventions that aren't necessarily that easy to control without design-specific software, which I don't assume that you've got. So regardless, knowing these design conventions and these typographic conventions can be a useful thing for you, especially perhaps further down the track of your careers when you're going to work maybe with creative practitioners. So unless anyone's got any questions, I'm going to crack on with this alphabet. Okay, the first letter A is for audience. First and foremost, you want to make your content appropriate and accessible to the audience who you want to target with this poster, to give them the experience that you want them to have. That could be audience appropriate in terms of specific usability criteria, their level of expertise, or just a visually appropriate style for the people you want to see the poster. In academia, you probably will have been or will be called on to design conference posters about your research. These are frequently terrible. So resist the urge to just copy the style of what you see in those conference contexts. They're often ineffective, and perpetuating those conference conventions doesn't really up the game of posters. Here's a bunch of people proudly posing with their poster wares. I just found this on the internet, and these are by no means the worst posters I've ever seen, but there's not a lot to entice me to read them. The conference poster default style is definitely one worth challenging. So if you are designing a poster for a conference, check what the actual rules are, like the size of the poster, for instance, and check what's just kind of convention and people just following each other blindly. Really think about what the point of the poster is. Do you want to get people to talk to you? Do you want them to access a paper? Do you want them to laugh? Pop yourself in their shoes and really hone your messages and test those messages and that poster design on your friends, your colleagues, and you can edit and iterate based on what you learn. So just to get you thinking a bit about audiences, here's an example of a design project that was very audience-centric, definitely not posters. These are some art books for kids based on artifacts in the Te Papa collection. They're for kids, so the format's robust, it's small enough for little hands to handle, and the typeface is readable and it's cheerful. The colors are playful, and we also tested this book with children to understand that they understood the content, which meant we had to make a few changes. When the 3-year-olds we tested on told us in no uncertain terms that Michael Parakofai's Red Piano, if you know it, was in fact very much an orange piano. So although we wanted to appeal to children, we also had an audience of design literate adults because they'll be the ones buying the book, they'll be the one reading the book to or with the kids, which is why there's no fake crayon scrawling on these. There's a degree of sophistication, which is all kind of the audience targeting we were doing. B is for balance. Visual balance occurs when the weight of one or more things is distributed proportionately in space. Balancing the content with the white or negative space, by which we mean the empty or breathing space on a page, not just the white bits, is really important. It lets things breathe and then they become more sophisticated as a result, and it helps the viewer orientate themselves and improves cognition. So think carefully about the reading order, which is determined by the hierarchy, which we'll come to, but also conventions of top to bottom and left to right reading order. Balance doesn't mean like on a set of scales with everything sort of statically balanced around a center, or stacked up like an overstuffed supermarket shelf. Asymmetry on your poster page will help the layout feel harmonious but dynamic. So again, another non-poster. This is a book designed for an artist, and you can see that the cover of the box that holds the book is deliberately bare, and the isolation, because there's lots of white or brown space around it, the eyes draw you in because of that. On the back of the book, you can see that there's an asymmetrical balance of the columns and the visual elements, and it's harmonious, but there's a tension there because the asymmetry is activating the space. Though a centered design by its very nature is balanced, it won't ever feel dynamic, and dynamism is what will help you engage the reader. So a couple of actual posters. On both, there's a title at the top, and information is placed in text boxes that follow a logical order. There's quite a lot of white space, which, as well as looking uncluttered, draws the eye towards images and then towards headings, so it's easier at a glance to see what's what. The layouts are reasonably dynamic in the way the eye is led through the page. In the example on the right, even though it messes with the top to bottom reading order with this upward sweeping arrow, which is used because it's suggesting an increasing amount of disciplinary blending, there's still a really clear reading order. C is for content. So with slides and with posters, generally speaking, where words are concerned, less is more. Try not to use slides as a script and try and resist squishing your entire research paper or project onto a poster page. There's always a tension between wanting to document information almost like a report where you need to explain things and having people listen to you while they're looking at your really carefully chosen visuals and choice words. You need to strike that balance on a poster. At a conference, it's really awkward standing there next to your poster, expecting someone to read 3,000 words, but also trying to strike up a conversation. It's much better to give a taster and have a deeper engagement off the back of it. As much as possible, use plain language and make findings accessible to a wider, non-expert audience. That's a real skill, and it's not about dumbing down your research. In the context of Te Puna Hamatatini, and to be honest, most academic conferences, you've got broad fields working on different angles of a common theme, and there's no way we're all fluent in all disciplinary languages. C is also for color and contrast. So use a limited number of colors that work well together, no more than 5, graphs included, and use those colors with purpose and systematically. So for instance, titles might all be in one color. Accent colors can be used to draw attention to where you want people to look, so use that sparingly. If you emphasize everything, you emphasize nothing. Check that there's a really strong contrast between the background and the text. If you see some good design out there that uses a color palette that you think works well and is appropriate for your audience, I suggest you borrow it and try similar in your own work. There are lots of free tools out there to suggest pleasing and accessible color palettes like this one, Adobe Color, which also lets you drop in an image to pick the colors out of. So if you do find something that works, that's a really useful tool to help you access that color palette. This is one of my posters from a conference, in fact, and you can see that there's a really strong color palette. It's a unifying element that builds a brand and identity for a project. Here, the colors are yellow, cyan, and black. The rationale for that might seem a bit of a stretch, but it was rhetorically deliberate. So CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, are the ink colors used in printing from which all other colors are made. And if you've ever changed a toner cartridge, you will know this. Using 3 of those colors together was a nod to bringing a process back to basic elements, which is what the project does too. So it all helps to bring those elements together. And it really helps that cyan and yellow look great together as well. On contrast, when you're crafting with words that you want people to read, you really need to treat them as words, not as pictures. Architects and spatial people have a really bad habit of treating text like something they can mess with in space, like a building material. And unfortunately, that can make it really quite hard to read, which, unless that's your intention and it's a real conceptual piece, that's a really bad idea. So be careful with things like super light text and poor contrast on color. In this poster example, there are some good things going on, but that background image interferes too much with the text. Your best bet for readable, accessible text is black text on a white background. Just a plug here for your future selves when you might have budgets for such things. D is for designers, and working with a designer means you'll end up with a better product, for sure a better poster, but a designer in the mix of a whole project can add more value than just making things look and work better. That's not just because they know their way around some fancy software. We'll also use a process that might help tease out some of the things you hadn't thought of. We'll ask good, stupid questions that'll help you hone your messaging, and we'll tell you if your graphs are incomprehensible to someone without a maths PhD. We'll help center the communities that you're working for and with. The process of working with a designer will hone your storytelling and make your poster and your research better in myriad ways. So here's an example of me explaining to Hazel that how I, as a non-psychologist, interprets her choice of images. It's classic stupid question stuff. We're very good as designers at saying what we see, and we can be a really useful proxy for other non-expert audiences. E is for evoking the right emotion and engineering the right experience. I would normally just call this personality, but P is too late in the alphabet and it's really important. So I think it's one of the things that's really helpful to nail down at the start. What do you want your poster to feel like? What does your research feel like? And what's right for the audience? This is a slide from a course that I teach on editorial design. It can be really useful to list 5 words that describe your subject as you want it to be interpreted. This helps you test and refine as you go along, and you can come back and check you're hitting the tone that you wanted. So is your project and your poster supposed to look progressive or conservative? Is it quiet or loud? Is it serious or fun? And how do you channel these words into this set of words that you can use to define the personality of your project? So for instance, this was a zero waste fashion project that I worked on. The whole project's ethos and also the subsequent posters needed to embody these words: systematic, designerly dynamic, approachable, and modifiable. We created a font that used elements from the garment construction system. We paired the posters back to a single color, and the series of posters themselves came together to make a full-size garment pattern on the reverse. It hit the emotional and functional notes that we were aiming for. And there's a credibility dimension to this as well. Some things just say believable and have authority, and others just don't. So here on the left, we have a war memorial. The words that come to mind, I think, when you think about war memorials might be things like serious, classic, orderly, authoritative, contemplative, thoughtful. Yeah, this war memorial and this warning sign on the right are set in Comic Sans, which isn't inherently poor font, by the way. It's just probably a poor choice when you want to be considered and serious. Typefaces and styles have connotations, some of which are obvious, some of which aren't. And testing with people, especially designers, can be a really good way to sense check that. Oof, F is for fonts. Another way you can get the tone right in your poster is the fonts that you choose. You should be using 1 or 2 typefaces maximum throughout your poster, and there are good open source options out there. So I said 1 or 2 typefaces, and that's less limiting than you might think. Typeface and font get used as synonyms, and usually that's absolutely fine, but there is a difference. A typeface is a collective name for a family of related fonts. So here on the screen, we have Adrian Frutiger's famous Univer typeface family, while fonts refer to the weights, widths, and styles that constitute a typeface. So each of Univer's weights and width and style combinations is a font. This seems a bit pedantic, and it is a bit pedantic to be fair, but you never know. It might come up in a pub quiz, and it does mean that you could use a variety of fonts from a typeface family, but still have a harmonious end result. So there are whole classification systems that break typefaces down based on historical precedents and technologies that made them. And you really don't need to know all of that, but it is useful to know some type basics. At the very top level, there are text typefaces, sans serif typefaces, and serif typefaces. Serifs are the little pointy feet or the pointy bits, and sans means without, so without pointy bits. So here's some examples, and I've noted a couple of open source fonts here that are available on Google Fonts and other platforms. You'll also notice that some fonts have a serif and a sans serif pairing, and they're designed to work nicely together. So IBM Plex, which is a current favorite of mine there, has a sans and a serif, and Merriweather also has a sans and a serif. That can be a good way to go because you know that they've been designed to work well together. Sans serif and serif typefaces are generally the kinds of typefaces that you can read. So they're your go-to for books or signs or web or posters. Anytime you want quick transformation of information into cognition. People will say that you should always use a serif for body copy, but this idea that serifs are easier to read is not actually substantiated. It's really a case of we read best what we read most. So this on the left is from a spatial design journal. The body text is set in a sans serif and the titles are in a serif. So that's something that some design a better poster people say is a no-no, but I think it works here because the serif has a seriousness, but the sans serif is less formal than you might expect for a journal. And that contemporary style is what the publishers were hinting at with their design choices. In the zoom into the poster on the right, you can see that there are two typefaces used. A sans serif Calibre in multiple weights plus italics for titles, captions, annotations, and intro text, and Courier Prime, which is a monospaced serif typewriter style font, which alongside bits of handwriting was suggesting an informality and a low fineness, but they're all working really harmoniously together. So alongside sans serif and serif typefaces, there's everything else in the typeface world. Typefaces for display or decorative purposes. These are the kinds of things you may occasionally use for headlines or titles or for expressive elements or as part of a themed project, but you're not going to be setting the bulk of your body copy in any of these. So as an example, here's a typeface called Closed Worlds, which has been designed to be a bit retro, to suggesting closure and to have this bold, blocky sensibility with some shared or recycled bits where the letters overlap. And that really matches the content of the book that it was used for, which is about the architecture of closed, self-sustaining physical environments. So there's a real synthesis of the type choice and the project purpose. So in essence, when it comes to choosing fonts, avoid novelty, though you can choose interesting fonts for titles. Really limit your palette and stick to one or two typefaces. Typefaces do have personality, so just really think, does this feel right? Does this match the personality that I'm going for? The only serif for reading thing, that's not actually true, so you can ignore it. And used tried and true typefaces that come as standard with your operating system or buy rather than illegally download well-crafted typefaces or use good open source options. So a couple of offers here. One of my current favorites is IBM Plex, which is a super family of sans serif, serif, and also monospaced fonts over numerous weights. FontPair is a website that offers up open source combinations, some of which are better than others. And Typewolf is a great type resource generally, but it also has a really useful download of suggested Google font pairings. So all Google fonts are available to download for free. So that might get you started. G is for grids and guides. You don't build a house without a plan and without scaffolding, and the same applies to posters. I'm going to use the term the term grid really loosely here. It's really important in design software, but It's going to be a little bit more hacky for you doing this in maybe PowerPoint or other things. For your presentation, it might be a series of page guides that you drag onto your slides. A grid, along with our next up hierarchy, will help you achieve the balance and a system that will work for a variety of content within your one poster or other publication. So think about the text and images before designing with them. Sketch out and test your grid and your content as a poster mock-up, and work out how those relationships between text and other elements might work. This means thinking about the overall architecture of the page so the relationships make sense. Even in PowerPoint, you can set up grid lines to give your page some structure. This is a peep under the hood of one of my documents in InDesign, which is the primary software that designers will use for this kind of work. You can see that there are columns and flow lines, and they're supporting the structure of the typography, and that a multi-column grid allows you to set the text using different modular widths. It's allowing the management of the white space and the isolation of titles and the placement of text in columns, which are wider columns for primary body copy and narrower ones for text that has a supporting role, which we'll come back to. H is for hierarchy and headings. Because you're designing and writing this poster with the reader in mind, we want to make the logical flow of sections as easy as possible for the viewer to follow. As we said in B for balance, some of this comes from the placement on the page, and some of it will come from your hierarchy, which is most clearly seen through your series of heading styles. A series of nested headings become the pillar of your story. Even if you wrote the text, you need to read it again and interpret the tone, the tempo, and the logical structure. That will help you determine the size and position of elements on the page. Things that go together should be closer to each other than they are to other things. More important things should be bigger, but bigness isn't just about size. It can also be about isolation. A graphic element can appear larger or smaller depending on the size, the placement, and the color of the elements around it. So think about the rhythm and the pace and the reading order and the relative level of importance. So in this book, the way that the title is isolated, it helps elevate it in the hierarchy. Here you can see titles, subheadings, body copy, and footnotes are all treated differently, so we know that they're performing different roles or functions. I can't emphasize this enough. Really reuse your styles. You don't need to have 6 different sizes of body copy and randomly chosen sprinklings of heading styles throughout your poster, unless they actually mean something different. So this is a look at how it looks in one of my InDesign files. This is a styles menu in InDesign, and you can see I use a convention of H1 for the biggest heading. And in this file, I have 5 nested styles and then body copy types beyond headings and caption styles. So they're hierarchically listed. If you stick to using the same headings across the same level of content, you build a consistency. If your body copy is all of the same importance, use the same style for all of it. Don't randomly switch it up unless it means something. Equally, if text is of lesser importance, like a footnote or a page number, you don't need to make it all flashy and big. I is for imagery. A big and recognizable image helps a poster get noticed. One hero visual that's related to your research and has an ability to hook people in from a distance can be really useful. To be honest, that's unlikely to be a graph. You could use a compelling photograph, an illustration, or perhaps some kind of visual metaphor. This poster is almost entirely image-based. The illustrations demonstrate the concepts in the poster far better than screeds of text would have done. They set a human tone that's really appropriate. This isn't for a conference context, but an approach like this could absolutely be adapted to a research paper. The title sets the area of work, and the 5 smaller images lead to one larger one, which has the main takeaway. The role of restoration collectives is to empower collective action for the natural world. If you do want to use a background image, you need to make sure that there's adequate contrast. This poster about a disaster preparedness app uses an image of Wellington to situate the project, and it's carefully chosen so the text is only on the sky portion of the image. Statistics supported by accurate and illustrative narrative visuals can be useful. And this is an example from a non-designer. You can see the limitations a little bit of the software here. This was from Julie Mugford, who was at the time a PhD student. And she did a really nice job here of illustrating her key concepts that commonly algorithms in nature identification apps use a majority vote to classify identifications. So she was saying if two or more people say a weka, it's that a picture is a weka, and one says it's a kiwi, then the weka wins. But Julie's project suggested that majority vote was flawed, and the weight of the ecologist of the year, her middle illustration here, should carry more weight than our two enthusiastic but inexperienced participants. So simple graphics and images convey this really quickly and playfully. And sometimes a catchy metaphor can get the point across way more easily as a visual than trying to talk that through in text. These foodstuffs illustrate the difference between cross, multi, inter, and transdisciplinary practice. If you do need to source icons for images, the Noun project is a really great resource. You can use these for free if you give attribution to the designer, or you can pay a minimal amount to use them without attribution. You could also potentially, if it had purpose, push imagery into the interactive realm. Here on the left, we have a poster that invites contributions. And on the right, there's a student project that has overlaid a typeface specimen that the student designed with augmented reality add-ons, which was done in some software called Unity. Again, this would need to have purpose to make it really resonate. This is a poster for Mathscraft, a great TPM project, about their classroom box to help teach about fractals. And it has a 3D folded fractal box on the poster to bring it off the page, but to specifically suggest the tactile exercises that the project incorporates. Oof. J is for justified, and I'm going to stretch the J thing a little bit by talking about text alignments generally, one of which is justified. So here are 4 arrangements: centered, left aligned, right aligned, and justified. I am going to strongly advise you that you stick with left aligned text with no hyphenation. It's by far the easiest to read. Justification is rarely justified, though it's really popular. It crops up a lot, but it's actually a really expert skill to get justified type to look good without getting these spotty holes in the text, which get known as rivers, white lines that draw the eye and make reading harder. You should never actually really notice the spaces in text consciously. I saw this poster recently, and you can see what I mean about big gaps drawing the eye. This caption should be smaller in the hierarchy than the body copy around it. And if it was also left aligned, the big gaps would resolve themselves and the text would be much more harmonious. Oof, we're whistling through this. I hope you're still with me. K is for kerning and tracking. Another one of those type rules that seems kind of arbitrary, but it's actually just about making things more comfortable to read. No big gaps to notice and no squishing things so you find it harder to read. Kerning is about the relationship between individual pairs of letters, whereas tracking is about the universal letter spacing between letters in a word or a body of text. You'll only ever really need to kern big title text, and tracking is something you might tweak for titles or adjust for body copy only if the font has excessive spacing. Basically, you want words to flow without awkward gaps. These are some classic kerning fails. If you just squint at the ones on the left and right, you'll see why these are fails. So you want the gaps to be meaningful and help people understand what they're looking at, what they're reading. Kerning's really hard to manage meaningfully in anything other than design programs like InDesign or Photoshop and Illustrator. If you are using a program that allows you to manage kerning, what you're going for is optically balanced text. So you're looking for optical resonance and consistency between the spacing. And once you get a feel for bad kerning, you will start to notice it everywhere, and it will drive you absolutely balmy. So lowercase letters are meant to create uniform words that draw the eye horizontally, and they don't slow the eye by looking at each individual character. So we generally read the shape of words that are set in lowercase. But uppercase or capital letters, they're obviously uniform in height, so we read the individual letters. Hence, a bit of room, if you're using something in all caps, is fine, and it can even help as long as the spaces between the letters don't get near the size of the spaces between the words. So these examples set in InDesign show tracking at -5 for sentence case text, which looks pretty good, plus 100, positive 100, which isn't great because the spaces start to interrupt the ability to read the text. In caps, we've got it set at +5, which is okay, but it's still quite dense. And positive 100, which actually starts to look quite elegant. You can tweak tracking or letter spacing in programs like PowerPoint, where it's called character spacing. So in the heading in this example, I condensed the spacing slightly as it was large and it was appearing a little bit loose and baggy. But bringing it together makes the spacing a little bit less noticeable, less, my eye is getting drawn less to the spacing. Okay, L is for line length. There are a few things in here that I had previously had under T for text or C for columns or S for size, but as they're all related to lines of text, I've kind of crammed them all in under the L. You should, as we've already touched on, expect to have different line lengths for different levels in your hierarchy, just as you have different sizes of text. Some poster guides suggest that you should be able to read all your text on a poster from a meter away. I don't actually think that's true. Your titles obviously need to draw you in, but you do not need to have mega-sized captions that you can read from a meter. So different content needs different line lengths. So to a reader's eye, if you have a really short line, that can be tiring or distracting, and equally a really long line can also disrupt the ability to read text. A long line length or a long measure disrupts the rhythm because a reader has to locate the next line of text, and that can be quite uncomfortable for the eye. And the only time a super narrow measure is acceptable is for small amounts of text like captions or in an index. For optimum readability, you want the measure to be between 40 and 80 characters, including spaces. For a single column in a book or a report, 65 characters is considered ideal. So you can see in this book, a different line length has been chosen for the introductory style text for a chapter versus the directory index style section at the back. And with that, a variation in the text size. But you'll notice that the typeface is all the same, so it's building that uniformity. Like with headings, you want to be consistent with the line length for where you've got content that is the same it's like content. It's doing the same kind of thing. This post is kind of confusing because as well as having no hierarchy in the typography, the line length for the figures are arbitrarily they arbitrarily change. So whereas this poster on the right has distinct line lengths for different types of information. So body copy, diagram text, explanations, footnotes, and supplementary information. They all use the same line length to build this consistent system and suggest the relative importance of text. So yeah, try and keep with a consistent line length for your body copy, a consistent line length for your captions to kind of build that continuity and build that system. I'm going to squeeze in another L here. L is for leading. Leading is the space between the lines of text that plays a big role in readability. Correctly spaced lines make it easier for a reader to follow the type and improves the overall appearance of text. There's a bit of a Goldilocks situation here. The longer the line length, the more leading or interline spacing is needed. And also, if you've got larger type, you'll probably, like for instance, in titles, you will be able to decrease the interline spacing. So generally speaking, with body copy, your leading will be bigger than your point size. So in InDesign, if you're setting something in 12-point, 15 or 16-point leading would generally work well. On most presentation software that you'll likely use, it might be a few percent, or you might get lucky and find the defaults give you enough control. I've rarely found in Keynote or PowerPoint that I want to go bigger than single line spacing. So these examples here show the good, the bad, and the ugly. And here, this book on the right shows how well-considered leading and appropriate text sizing can build an optical consistency. So the density of the leading exists across the body copy and the captions in terms of the relative relationship between text and the spacing between the lines. That's what you're going for. A quick and easy one. M is for macrons. We live in a bilingual country, so choose typefaces that have macrons and use them. We originally specified another typeface for this set of books, but it became clear that it was going to be an absolute nightmare adding macrons manually to all our Tereo words, so we swapped pretty promptly. M is also for manipulation, by which I mean doing odd things to text. Perhaps it's harder to do in presentation software than design software, but wherever, it's a no-no. Don't go stretching, squashing, skewing, swishing, squishing, generally munting letter forms. A designer has produced those to work well in their intended style. If you want to use a slanted text, choose an italic text. If you want stretched out looking text, choose an extended font. If you want text that looks more condensed, use a condensed font. Don't try and manually do it yourself. N is for negative space, which we've already mentioned a few times. It's also known as white space, and it really acts as the breathing space on a page. So we covered this in balance, but it's worth reiterating. Negative space or empty or open space around an object helps define it. It's the breathing room, and it gives the subject room to breathe, and it makes it look more appealing. And I think the key takeaway is that you don't need to fill up a poster page entirely. The negative space can be used to isolate elements, and that can really speak to the content. So here in these examples, on the left, we've got a book about a quarantine island. So the isolation of the text helps reinforce that. And on the right, we're using the white space to manage attention in the graphic assemblage, which talks to the content a little bit. In the poster context, you might have come across the Better Poster movement. In essence, what they're saying is that your poster should have a really large claim or finding with heaps of clear or negative space around it, and your results and discussion are bulleted, generally speaking, around the edge. To be honest, I'm not fully convinced by this approach. That's a lot of real estate and actually a lot of printing costs for a big empty color block on the page. But I do absolutely agree that the standard chock-full academic poster model is quite hellish. Breathing space is your friend. Another quick one, O for orientation. Generally speaking, if type is meant to be read, the default should be to keep it horizontal. Roman letters are designed to sit side by side, not on top of each other, not stacked. So stacks of lowercase letters can be especially awkward because the ascenders and descenders, the bits that stick above and stick below the lines, make the vertical spacing appear uneven. And the varied widths of the characters make the stacks look precarious. You can get away with sideways text, kind of like on the spine of a book or here in this photograph on a building, but keep it to titles or very small pockets of text if you need to do it at all. So P. This is pretty self-explanatory, I hope. You need to give yourself enough time to proofread your poster really carefully. In fact, you want to get someone to do it with fresh eyes. I find it's almost impossible to read the details of text that I've written without filling in what I meant rather than what I actually put on the page. You also need to print your poster out full size. You should be able to tile print on most A4 or A3 posters, so you can actually get a sense of the relative size of the text, and you can check everything works well before you send it to be printed, because that can be quite an expensive exercise. If you're going to be standing next to your poster in a poster session at a conference, it really helps to actually verbalize and practice your quick explanation of your research, where you can point to elements on your fantastic poster as you do so. Otherwise, it can be super awkward in those sessions, so it's well worth having your script nailed and practiced. Q is for QR codes, the one thing that COVID gave us in a positive way. QR codes are now mainstream, so you can use them on your poster, and it's still worth adding URLs to for those who won't use a reader to open a QR code URL. They let people find out more about you and your department, or perhaps access your publication. R is for resolution. So you've been given dimensions for your poster. For the Hui, it's A0 portrait or A1 landscape. A0 is pretty large, so if you're adding photographs or graphics, you need to make sure you're not stretching these way beyond 100% of their actual size. If you do have control of your file export settings, you want to choose the highest resolution possible. Ideally, for printing, that's 300 dpi or ppi, dots per inch or pixels per inch or more. You might get away with 150 dpi, but really not less. Basically, just choose the highest resolution setting that you can find if you're using PowerPoint. On that, you should export for print as a PDF, ideally, and we'll come back to that in a second. S is for software. Chances are you don't all have Adobe InDesign licenses kicking around and the time to learn it, but it is the industry standard for this kind of print work, and it's what designers will use. So InDesign is for publications and posters and things like that. Photoshop is for raster images, and Illustrations for vector images, which we will come to shortly. So you'll probably be using PowerPoint or Keynote to craft a poster, which will be fully adequate for what you're doing. I'd also suggest maybe taking a look at Canva, which is a website that has numerous templates that you can adapt and build on. And if you do want to learn some design software, but don't want to stretch to one of the Adobe products, Affinity Publisher is a good quality budget option if you want to learn how to use some layout specific software. So S is for sizing. Check the size requirements and design to that. I can't emphasize this enough. You'll be in all kinds of hell if you've been thinking you're designing something for an A0 poster and it turns out that you've been designing it on an A4 document. It will be a real pain in the neck. A designer will produce a specific output for the size use. Rarely is it okay just to scale up or scale down like an A4 into an A3 or the other way around. The A series of documents is standard in Europe and Australasia, but the Americans, they have their own system. So if you're presenting at a US conference, double check the size requirements, especially if you're having something printed over there. In PowerPoint, I found this page size under the File Page Layout tab, and you specify a custom size based on the A sizes that you've been given for the conference that you're speaking at. I've already mentioned this multiple times, but you do really need to test your poster. Test print to proof it. Test it works on your audience by roping in friends and colleagues to give you feedback. You need to test, evolve it, edit it, and repeat that process. In other words, you really need to iterate. Design is like writing. You'll make drafts, you'll let them percolate for a bit, and you might share it with people, and you'll edit and evolve based on feedback. Whatever you're designing, you can get closer to the right solution by asking for feedback. That's the essence of a human-centered design process. So here's a wall of test versions of a book cover I worked on. This is an early stage with lots of different directions, which were then honed down to one, and that iterative process starts. And this on the right is testing wireframes for an app with real people. So whatever you're designing, testing and iterating will improve it hugely. U is for usability, how effectively, efficiently, and satisfactorily a user can interact with an interface or a design. Related to that is accessibility, which describes the set of properties that allow a product, service, or facility to be used by people with a wide range of capabilities. In essence, if you want people to engage with your work, to read it, there are some basic good practice things to consider to make sure you're not excluding anybody. There are a couple of things I want to bundle under this U that should really have gone under L for legibility and R for readability, but we'll cram them all in here. So legibility is the ease with which a reader can recognize individual characters. That concerns the shape of the actual letters. And this is constrained by things like the X height, which we'll touch on later, the width, the contrast, those kinds of things. These are all controlled by the type designer, not by you. So just some things to think about when choosing, like a taller X height. You can probably see in this example, a taller X height is more legible. So Caslon's X height is higher than Dido's, and it's more comfortable to read. And also contrast can really affect this as well. So the contrast of Dido with its thicks and thins is a lot harder to read than Caslon, which is more consistent. So these are all elements of legibility, and legibility is a subset of readability, which is where you have more control. So readability is related to how type is arranged or typeset, and therefore it's fully controlled by the designer. And it's really about how easy it is to read words in a block of text. Typesetting is very detail oriented, and there should be a mix of legibility and readability considerations in your design. So the choice of typeface, the font size, the line length, the leading, just to name a few, are some of the elements that you will control to make your design considered and make text legible. Getting it right will come with practice, and it will come with that feedback and critique. So some things that you want to consider: setting text in all caps, for instance, is really challenging. Don't ever do that. It's the lack of ascenders and descenders, which as we've said before, we really need to contribute to the recognition of characters. When you've got blocks of uppercase text, it's really hard to read. So don't do that. This is actually a menu I saw on a train, a wine list I saw on a train in America. So you're going on this train, it's jiggling up and down. You're trying to read this block of heinous, shouty text. It's just, I don't know what they were thinking. Other things you might consider in this area, we've touched on making sure there's adequate contrast. There's also a color element to this. So it's just worth thinking that when you're printing things in CMYK, which you will be, and that's how printing works, anything other than those solid colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, will be made of dots. So if you get a magnifying glass and look at any printed page, you'll see the dots that make up the different colors. That can be especially problematic when you're using tints of colors, so lighter versions of colors. It can mean that if you're using those for text, that it becomes far too delicate to read and the text breaks apart. So I would suggest black for text, or if it's going to be a heading in another color, trying to use something that's as solid and dark as possible. A segue from usability into what could be V for visual impairment. So about 4% of the population has some form of color blindness, usually red-green. That can be particularly important when designing interfaces where colors can mean something in relation to actions, but even in print, it's worth considering for things like graphs. You can check designs against online emulators, see how they'll appear to people with different color blindness types. V, we're getting there now. I'm going to blast through the end of the alphabet. V is for vector as opposed to raster. These are file formats. So vector formats are made up from points, lines, and shapes. And because they're created mathematically, they can be scaled to any size without losing quality. Raster images, on the other hand, are made up of a grid of pixels, and they're best suited for photographs or other images that contain a lot of detail. Because raster images are made up of pixels, they can become pixelated or lose quality when they're scaled, which is why we don't want to scale images, photographs bigger than their 100% of their actual size. As much as possible, you want to export in a vector format for printing. The type will be crisper and clearer if you do. You want to avoid image file formats. A PDF will be your best bet. So PDFs can include images that are themselves raster formats, but if you export as a PDF from PowerPoint or Keynote or any other software, elements that can be vector will be vector. So that's the way where you want to go. This is another potentially pedantic typography detail. W is for widows and orphans. This is a kind of thing that typographers and designers notice. And it's not entirely so we can sneer that you don't know that these things are a thing. A widow is a very short line, usually one word at the end of a hyphen or the end of a hyphenated word at the end of a paragraph or column. A widow is considered poor typography because it leaves too much white space between the paragraph or the bottom, between paragraphs or the bottom of a page, and that interrupts the reader's eye and it diminishes the readability. You can fix widows and orphans by reworking the width of a column or perhaps editing your copy. So like a widow, an orphan is a single word or part of a word or a very short line, but it appears at the start of a column. The result of an orphan is poor horizontal alignment at the top of a column or page. The concept really is the same. They both interrupt the ability to read the text comfortably, so try and fix them if you can. Okay, X is for X height, and I was really scraping for another X because we already touched on X height a little bit, but I'm going to use it as an opportunity to nod to some terminology that you don't really need to know, but it might be useful for you to know that it's a thing for when you work with designers in the future. So as I said, a taller X height tends to lead to more legible typefaces. And lowercase letters, for instance, have ascenders and descenders, which we've also touched on. The holes in the letters are called counters. The ends are called terminals. The text sits on a baseline. It has an X height and a cap height, which is the height of capital letters. The lines of text are called strokes. This is perhaps just another good pub quiz fact. I really like this one. The dot on an I is called a tittle. All these things have a whole series of very specific names. Okay, we're really, really nearly there. Y is for you and your supporters. Don't forget to put your contact details and even perhaps a photo on your poster. A photo can help humanize your poster, but importantly, at a conference, it makes you recognizable if people want to track you down and talk to you. If you professionally use social media, you might add your handles and you'll want to name check your department or your funders or your supervisors and team. We've already covered URLs and QR codes. I would suggest having a block on your poster where you group all these details together about your institution, any logos you need, all those required bits. Some people will put this at the top. Personally, I think it works just as well at the bottom. So here's one of my conference posters, 2 QR codes, one for a paper, one for a website, pics of me and Rianne, our names, our titles, and some brief thanks, all grouped together. Y is also for you've got this. There's a lot that I've just crammed in there, quite a high level design stuff. So you're probably all flummoxed. I just want you to remember these things, if nothing else. This is your checklist. You want to use an appropriate style for your audience and give that some thought. You want your poster to not be cluttered. So pare things back and try and keep them as balanced as possible. Everything you do should have purpose and it should be done in context. You want to be consistent with fonts and sizes and colors, all those things to build a system. If your text is supposed to be read, you want to treat it like text to read. Don't make it into pictures, don't stick it on crazy backgrounds, just keep it readable. You want to select visuals to help with your storytelling and to craft those so it gives you a really cohesive narrative, and you want to write that really carefully for your audience, but also for people who may not have your expert dialogue. You want to choose your fonts carefully. You want to keep your text left aligned with good contrast and a comfortable line length. And also, you don't need to use a double space after a full stop. Those last 4 ones are part of a selection of Designing for Dyslexia Good Practice guides. Use macrons and other punctuation conventions. Again, being consistent with those. Test, iterate, test again, iterate again, test again, keep going around in that circle. You won't get it right first time. And I've introduced quite a few design and type rules there, and they're really never supposed to be pointlessly pedantic or to trip you up. It's always about trying to center the reader in the experience. So just try and sense check everything you're doing, make sure that it's actually helping people navigate their way through your wonderful content. And I'm sure a few of you have drifted off into Zen world already, so enough from me. I'm going to shut up and I'll take any questions.